Hello everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and I am here today to talk about a new book, a comic book or a graphic novel, we might say, that I really loved, actually. It's called Anarchy in the Big Easy, A History of Revolt, Rebellion, and Resurgence. And I have the writer and the illustrator here with me. I'm going to let them begin by introducing themselves. And the writer is Max Cafard, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So, Max, why don't you start by telling us who you are?
Well, I'm a product of New Orleans. My family has been here for 13 generations. And one thing you can find out from the book is that New Orleans is a place of multiple identities and multiple personalities and masking. So that's that's part of who I am.
All right, is that good? Do you want to follow up on that? I know this could be a complicated introduction if you want it to be. It's up to you.
No, I love New Orleans. I've always loved the history of New Orleans. Uh, I'm inseparable from the place, from the culture, and I'm really happy we had a chance to do this kind of radical history, a subversive history of the city, and to tell people about things that they probably don't know about, and how wonderful this history of revolt and rebellion and regeneration really is. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's. I mean, I did just find it inspiring, thrilling. I found it thrilling. All right, but before we go on with that, Vulpus, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I go by Vulpes. That's my name for illustration. Um, I've been illustrating comics for probably about 15 years, and some of my work has been published on various journalistic sites like the Nib. I also helped run a anarchist comics press in New Orleans for a while, called JP Press. And I also am in love with New Orleans, and while I'm not originally from here, I've been in the region for about 12 years now, and I uh, no longer live in the city, but I live in the region outside of it, and yeah, I take a lot of inspiration from the city itself.
Okay, fantastic. I'm gonna ask Max in a second how the book came to be. I presume it started with Max, but we'll see. You can tell me if I'm wrong about that. But before, I just want to describe the book. At the time that we're recording, I think it's not officially out yet. But by the time this episode is released, it will either be out or coming out in a week or so. I'm not quite clear, but I do really recommend listeners that you get your hands on it if you can. It begins with, what you might call almost like cosmic anarchism, this idea that the river flows and there is nature and it is powerful and it is life, and then it flows through from this cosmic anarchism through all sorts of instantiations of, what I call everyday anarchism, the kind of basic practices that are anarchic, like Mardi Gras, for example. It goes through the actual history of capital A anarchism and the connection to famous anarchist figures like Reclus, and the coining of the word libertarian, which happens in New Orleans. And it goes through the very recognizable kinds of things that we would call anarchism or anarchy in terms of labor movements, uprising, the Black Panther Party. It's got, everyday anarchism, cosmic anarchism, capital A anarchism, mutual aid, all woven together in this. I mean, narrative is maybe not quite the right word, but it's kind of a narrative. It's almost like a tapestry. It's wonderful. And then Volpez's illustrations are just they're just so clean, and yet also wonderfully descriptive and very much themselves. And it seems to me that this is as good an introduction, especially since someone could sit down and read it in an hour, but also savor it as many times as they want, to the concepts that I am interested in this show as I have seen yet. So I just wanted to thank you two for doing this. This is amazing. All right, we lost video on Max as well, so now it's just me. Um, Max, are you still there though? At least
I am here. I
okay.
am somewhere. I
All
don't
right.
know because I can't see the picture anymore, but I think I'm somewhere.
Well, I can hear you, and I think where you are is probably New Orleans.
I
So
think it probably is.
So, Max, did this book start with you, or how did this book come to be?
Well, there isn't any starting point for anything. I mean, that's one thing we have to learn. Everything is a convergence of flows, like the Mississippi is a convergence of flows, and it created our land here. Everything is a convergence of flows, so it's a product of that. It's a product of what it expressed. It's a product of the fact that there is a city here and it does have a history, and there is a delta here and it does have a history. It's really important to understand all of these kinds of histories. There's social history, there's geohistory, there's ethnohistory, there's cosmic history, and we're part of that. So this is part of that. It also goes way back in my own life where I discovered these things. I mean, the first living in New Orleans, hearing stories about what the history of the city was, and then finding out some of them weren't true. And most of the ones that were true were only half true, and a lot weren't told at all. And so this is telling all those stories that haven't been told very much, or stories that are mistold. So the actual the text of the book came from a few things. I was collecting information on the history of the city for quite a while and images. And there was a conference in New Orleans, I guess about 10 years ago, that I helped organize, of the Anarchist Studies Network. And I put all the images together and I made up a text and I presented it to that group. So that's where it kind of converged as an identifiable thing or non thing. And I'm not. I guess somebody suggested publishing it as a book, and I thought about that, and then I found out about the fact that Mike was Vulpes was doing wonderful illustrations. I saw some of the uh, comic books from JP Press, I think it is, in New Orleans. And I thought the work was just amazing. And someone got me in touch with him, and we put this together. So that's how it came about, from my point of view, anyway.
Okay, Volpez, you want to carry that on?
Yeah, so John had gotten in touch with me through a friend.
Who?
We, sorry, take two here.
That's all right. You know,
So Max
no,
had
no,
gotten in touch
I
with.
mean, one thing you have to learn is that there is no personal identity. Go ahead.
um, yeah, so Max had gotten in touch with me through a friend about
No,
the.
Max got in touch with John, and John got in touch with Mike, and he got in touch with you.
Yeah, it was a big web. It was a
Sorry.
big messy web, and I had already been pretty heavily researching radical history in New Orleans, and specifically uh, visual culture in New Orleans. And we sort of obsessively, at the anarchist house I was living at, um, we were like obsessively archiving all the visual culture we could from the last 15 plus years. Um, and on top of that, I had been working as a swamp guide for years, and just was totally obsessed with the swamps and the wetlands that made New Orleans exist in the first place, and had been really steeped in that history. And so when this friend reached out that John who I had kind of known about but didn't really oh my god, Max, who I had kind of known about but didn't really know well. We just got in touch, and it felt like a really nice match.
Yeah, I guess let me follow up there then before we go over to Max, because I'm not familiar with your work besides this. So, it's got this very clean style. I don't know if they still use the term decompression. That was a big deal. What, in like the early 2000s, meaning the comics panels had less detail in them, kind of a rebellion against the like Dave Gibbons kind of thing. So is this your style generally when that you draw in, or did you adapt this to the text and the story of New Orleans? I was just curious about that creatively.
Well, so the style is mostly a product of the amount of labor that goes into drawing a comic. It's uh, sort of astronomical to try and produce more than a 16-page book. And my background was in producing comics very quickly for social movements that could be distributed as propaganda for free. And typically they would be somewhere between 12, 16, 20 pages. Um, so this really economical use of line was just necessary because I couldn't turn it into an art project. It needed to be done like yesterday, and it was kind of the same for this. Like, I think there would be an argument for a very chaotic style for New Orleans, a very fluid, elaborate style. But the reality was, I there was no way that comic was going to get done in time. So I stuck with this kind of um, immediate style that I really owe a lot to the great illustrator from Montreal, Sophie and now, who produced a really fabulous comic that had a huge impact on me when I was much younger, called "The War of the Streets and Houses," which was about the Quebec student strike. Um, that I highly recommend. And yeah, they just deploy this very economic use of line that you can tell they were able to distribute comics out in during the strike by using that style. So it seemed to kind of just make sense to stick with that.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I hadn't thought about just the continuity with a sort of pamphlet style. It looks great. You've got places where you filled the page with a lot of lines and some like cross hatching type thing that must have taken time. But I'm a minimal. I mean, it's clear and easy to follow and easy to read and works really well as a work of propaganda. It's fantastic.
Appreciate it.
So Max, you mentioned that you had, you'd been noting the sort of key moments in the book. I know I mentioned a bunch of them, and I think we've already established the first one. This idea of the water, the anarchic nature, the flow. I guess before we get to any of the others, do you? It seems to me that you could tell the story of New York City through Anarchy, and certainly Chicago. I mean, does New Orleans feel particularly anarchist to you among U.S. cities, or do you think this is what anyone would find if they were in a city and open to its history and its energy?
Oh, okay. It's a very difficult question. I certainly wouldn't say that I would think of New Orleans as anarchist, but it's anarchic. It has an anarchic spirit, which is expressed in the grassroots carnival, for instance, and has historically been expressed, for instance, in Storyville and jazz, the Mardi Gras Indians. A lot of what we cover in this book are the anarchic elements of the culture, but it's certainly not all of the culture. And obviously the revolt and rebellion were against something because the city has been part of many aspects of the system of domination. So there's not only the slave revolt of the enslaved people, but the slavery imposed by the slave holding elite. Uh, it's a dialectical relationship, you might say. So there's a wonderful history of early Reconstruction in New Orleans, but then there's this long period of reaction in which the culture was very repressive. Of course, there always was a Storyville, there still was a carnival, but there was the dominant culture. So I don't think you can't really describe a reality as complex as a city as just being anarchic or just being repressive or just being liberatory. It's a multitude of things.
Yeah, of course. I think that's right. It does seem that at least, and again, speaking of someone, I'm not from New Orleans. I've only visited the city once. It does seem that there is a sense that in the American imagination there is something anarchic
Yeah,
about New Orleans. I mean, I guess in a good sense. I guess in a bad sense as well. I mean, it seems that maybe post Katrina might be what many Americans think of if they think of anarchy in terms of the war of all against all, that kind of negative, violent sense of anarchy. But I was thinking more of Carnival and Bourbon Street. If people are envisioning a place in America where at least bubbling underneath the economic surface of control and hierarchy is liberation and anarchy. It does seem that New Orleans figures that way in the American imagination, and of course, jazz. I mean, jazz.
yeah. Well, I don't. I wouldn't pick out Bourbon Street as an example of that. That's really, the opposite. It's
I
what goes on in places that people don't know what's going on, or they have more trouble finding it. That's more of the official culture. It's more of the tourist culture, which is another problem. New Orleans is a city that's based on tourism, which is a very debilitating, uh, corrupting kind of industry. Also, there's the petrochemical industry all around us. So we also know, the worst of this world that we live in. In a way, New Orleans, I like to talk about New Orleans as being an edge city on the edge of empire, on the edge of the North and the South, on the edge of the continent. It's also on the edge of history. It's also I wrote this article, Carnival at the Edge of the Abyss, which was about this precarious place of the city. It's always on the edge of destruction. It's in a way a city that prefigures what's going to happen to much of the world in the future. We're going to disappear before most of the coastal cities disappear, but it's going to happen. So we are, in a sense, the harbinger of apocalypse. But
yeah,
that's one thing I should say about the anarchic element in the city. There are a lot of cities you can go to in North America that aren't very anarchic at all. So by comparison, it seems very anarchic, I think. But the other side of it is the anarchic is everywhere. It's even where you don't see it on the surface. It's even where, it's like André Breton, the great surrealist writer, said, uh, most people seem to have very boring lives, they're conformists and so forth. But when they fall asleep, they dream, and their dreams express the other side. They are visionaries, and when they're asleep. So you can always find the symptoms of the anarchic, even in the midst of the overly regimented.
yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I guess the only thing I wanted to follow up about is thinking about Bourbon Street, or when you write in the book, sort of the like the, I don't know what you call it, the public carnival or the official
Yeah,
carnival. It seems to me that we can do this dialectical thing where we say, oh, there's the official New Orleans of, where it's just sort of a standard 21st century American neoliberal city, and then there's this anarchy underneath it. But it seems to me there's also this dialectical version. I think Bourbon Street people do go to Bourbon Street because they have a taste for anarchy, but it's not what we are interested in when we are talking about anarchy. But I do think it registers this. I mean, Bourbon Street, I've been on Bourbon Street once for about 5 minutes, and it was just covered in vomit. And it just seems like this sense of the bad form of anarchy, of the purge, of the carnival as this destructive death drive, seems to be what some people think of when they think of anarchy in New Orleans.
Well, if you're talking about popular misconceptions of anarchy, maybe that's
Yeah.
it. But I don't even think these people think about anarchy.
Mm.
I mean, I've seen many of them, and they're looking for what they look for everywhere. Uh, Spring break could be described as anarchy, but it's not really anarchistic. I mean, everything that is a way of letting off steam should not be dignified with the concept of anarchia.
Yes, no, I agree, but
Arche,
I do think that popular misconception is strong,
yeah, I
and
don't
it's
know why we should talk about the popular misconception because it doesn't really help us understand anything. Misconceptions you can understand if we're talking about the popular mentality and ignorance of many things, we could diagnose it by looking at the misconception. But I'm more interested in finding out what this anarchic is in the city.
fantastic. Do you want to? And we'll come to Vulpes in a second with the same question, but do you want to pick out a part of the book and highlight the anarchic nature in it?
Well, you talked about the part on nature creating the delta, and the river being so central to our lives and our culture. That the next section of the book is on indigenous society, which I also think is a wonderful expression of the anarchic, because there was a small settlement in what's now a big sprawling city, New Orleans, called Blancmange, uh, which was part of a larger culture. One thing that's pointed out in the book is the Grand Village, it's called, of the Natchez Indians, was the largest community in the region. It was larger than New Orleans was until after the colonial period. There were also mounds built, which are older than the pyramids in Egypt. And these communities, in many cultures, were decentralized, autonomous, non-hierarchical, non-dominating communities. They were free cooperative communities. So I think that's a really important part of this story, and it also ties in with what happened later, because after slavery was instituted, there was people ran away from slavery and joined maroon communities, and they learned a lot from the Native Americans, and the Native Americans learned a lot from them, and they got along very well. And you can learn something about cooperation, mutual aid, decentralization. I would say the kind of social structures that existed before the conquest and persisted on the fringes of conquest are really a great lesson about what the anarchic means. Communities without arche, without domination.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I love those. I love those portions of the book. I mean, I guess the way I came to understand, the communities in, what is now the United States before the Europeans came is, I don't know, it's because I was educated 40 years ago. I mean, I was born in the 80s, but it was not until I was an adult that I understood that there were so many people in North America. I mean, I remember learning that there were the Aztecs and the Mayans. This was in, I don't know, maybe started in elementary school. There were large civilizations, large societies elsewhere, but that the part that is now the United States was more or less empty. And that's not true. It was never true, even though it was part of my education. And I think you did a great job in just a few pages of showing the civilization that was here before. So Volpez, I wanted to ask you as well if there's a part of the book that you wanted to talk about to make sure we covered.
Yeah, I would generally echo what Max was saying about the Maroons as a really strong aspect of the history of the region that surrounds New Orleans, and just like the diversity with which that happened. You not only had individuals fleeing uh, slavery and genocide, but also the community of St. Malo that formed out east of the city in the marsh by Lake Bourne. And that was, it existed up until the early 20th century as effectively a Maroon community. Um, and I think that especially with New Orleans often gets this spotlight as like ground zero for climate change or blah blah blah, like this type of 21st century look at the city, post Katrina look at the city. um, there's all these efforts to bring in engineers from the Netherlands and solve it through solutions by the Army Corps of Engineers and that type of Western dominating nature approach that in many ways has gotten us to this place and is in large part the reason why the swamps surrounding the city have shrunk rapidly and are now in many places open water, and including the area around St. Malo. And if we're looking for practical examples of what is useful about anarchism, like I don't think we actually really need to come up with some kind of blueprint or something. I think in a lot of ways the indigenous societies and the Maroon societies in our region offer us so much to learn from about a way of life that could exist beyond the logic of levees and flood walls and check dams and all this kind of flood control that's been so rampant, especially since 1915 and 1927 floods. Yeah, I think that those parts are so unique and just in their prevalence in the region.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I would even go so far as to say, I mean, besides just what's happening in the region, the fact that we have this global climate crisis is the result of this belief that we could control nature, master the forces, and make the earth exactly what we wanted it to be. So that means levees in New Orleans. It also means burning fossil fuels at a colossal rate, and the result is, I mean, I'm struck how often when I'm studying anarchism that it does just seem like there was you could say whatever, a more grassroots, a more organic, a more natural way of living that has in a lot of ways the sort of philosophical tradition of anarchism is just sort of recreating what was already there. I mean, that was to a large extent that was the point of the recent Graeber and Wingrove book, which does talk about Poverty Point and Natchez and various other things in this region, but just this idea that the cultures that came before us could actually teach us how to live in a way that would certainly be called anarchist from the perspective of the colonial Western imperialist angle that we have been living in for hundreds of years. I don't know if either of you want to say anything in response to that. Please do. I don't know how much that sense that made.
It makes sense. Yeah, it's quite true. And after the those societies, there have also been many things on the fringes of the dominant societies that have also been very inspiring. Uh, but we could talk about you mentioned Graeber and Wingrove. James Scott, of course, has done a lot of work on that too. He has a number of wonderful books. One on Zomia, about this large area in Southeast Asia, as large as Western Europe, in which they never submitted to a state or capitalism or anything else. And until the 20th century, really, the outside world of domination really didn't make inroads. But speaking of writers, there are three sections around the middle of the book that touch on some famous anarchist writers who lived in New Orleans. Élisée Reclus, who was the foremost geographer of his age, and also a major anarchist theorist and also activist. He was very important in the First International and fought in the National Guard in the Paris Commune and so forth. When he was a young man, he came to New Orleans and wrote about his experience. Much of it isn't published. He wrote two long essays on slavery in the United States, which are quite insightful. There's a great story that we included in the book about it would probably take too long to tell the story now, but it's an amazing story about the contrast between these decadent planters and the slave preacher who came to the plantation and delivers a very powerful message. Also, there's a section on Joseph Desjacques, who's also one of the foremost anarchist writers. And he actually did his two most important works in New Orleans, one of which is this anarchist utopia called L'Humanisphère, which I highly recommend reading. It has been a couple of translations. There's a decent translation out now. But it's a very visionary, almost it's a wild, almost insane, vision. But it's very inspiring. If anybody's familiar with Fourier, who was a great utopian, I think he's on that level. I think he should be recognized as one of the foremost utopian writers. He also wrote a famous open letter to Proudhon when he was in New Orleans, in which he basically coined the word libertarian or libertaire in French. And he said to Proudhon, he was really speaking to the public. He said, because of Proudhon's misogyny and patriarchal prejudices, and because he thought you could trace the contribution of any individual to the product of that person's labor, he was not a true libertaire. And that's where it came into French and later English usage. There's also this really another visionary writer, the Baron von Reitzenstein was his name. He was a Bavarian baron who immigrated to New Orleans the same time that Desjacques and Reclus was here in the 1850s. As a young man, he wrote this really amazing novel called Mysteries of New Orleans. I can hardly begin to describe it, but it is certainly anarchic in almost every sense of the term. And it's really a critique of all forms of domination. It's a great story also. It's kind of out of control. It has a lot of violence and betrayal and supernatural things. But there's also a critique of authoritarian religion, the state, the growing capitalism, patriarchy, and also the two most admirable characters in this book are a lesbian couple who are kind of the hero, among the heroes. The other heroes of the book are a mixed race couple that were supposed to give birth to a child who would be the liberator of the enslaved. And there's a kind of magical element of how they come together. I won't go into all this. It's an insane novel. It's wonderful. It's very readable. Mysteries of New Orleans is the name. Another thing we should at least mention is the story of labor history here in New Orleans.
Yes.
One of the great general strikes, which was a interracial, really industrial, not a trade strike, but that was amazing. There was also a streetcar strike, which was very militant and violent and had enormous public support. There's I want to know when you came to New Orleans whether you had a sandwich called a po' boy.
Yes.
It's a famous sandwich. It was invented during that strike when the people in the community made these sandwiches to give to the striking workers. There's also a great history of the IWW at that time, and the IWW organized the dock workers. So it was a kind of labor militancy and maximalism that's unusual in U.S. labor history, and is totally unknown in New Orleans, and really has no contemporary effects. I hope it'll be revived.
Yeah, I found all of that. I found all of that eye opening. We're coming to the end of our time, and I think for the rest of the stuff that's in the book, I just will recommend to the listeners that they read the book. Something did occur to me though. I'll put this to Vulpes first, I guess, as the final question, which is this book itself, right, is a collaborative product. I mean, every book, as John points out, even one that only composed of words and only has a single author, is a collaborative product, and in many ways is the expression of uh, thousands, millions, all of civilization. But this book in particular, it has two authors, so I'm just wondering if it felt like a the kind of cooperative project that we would want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one thing that really attracted me to the project was Max had so much knowledge and uh, experience, lived experience in the city, and um, one thing that the project really shed some light on to me is as someone I've been involved in the anarchist movement in New Orleans for a little over a decade, and there were things towards the end that Max hadn't heard of. That that frankly, I've gone to friends and comrades and been like, we really need to work on our communication. Like I know indie media isn't really a thing anymore, and we've had efforts for various communication projects. There was this newspaper, anarchist newspaper called The Shotgun. There was the Raging Pelican, but the fact that we weren't communicating with, you know, between generations was just like a huge failing. And being able to work on it with John and share some of those stories was, yeah, I mean, it really made all the work that we put into it feel, like it closed a circle or something. And I really appreciated that aspect of it.
Yeah. On the last page, by the way, we recognized all the groups and individuals who contributed to this. It's not a complete list, but there is a long list of people. And I should mention particularly Jeffrey Darrensbourg, who was an educator on indigenous history and values, and he was extremely helpful in the first part of the book. Uh, it was definitely in the largest sense a collaborative work.
Okay, that's wonderful. It's been such a pleasure to talk to the two of you, and I guess I just want to say, I hear from a lot of listeners out there, who are academics, who are intellectual, who know their Hegel from their Heidegger, but I know there's also a lot of people out there who do not want to read Hegel or Heidegger, and for whom a book like this, as I said already, will just serve as a beautifully accessible introduction, not just to the possibilities of anarchy in the Big Easy, but to what anarchy is and what it looks like. So, if you're interested, if you're anarcho curious, if you are looking for a gift to give someone to help them understand the ideas that you're interested in, I really recommend Anarchy in the Big Easy. Max and Vulpes, thanks for coming on the podcast to talk.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.